It is the 4th of March, 1944, and above the German city of Berlin, a formation of American bombers is grinding through flak-torn air at 27,000 feet. For the first time in the war, fighters are riding alongside them this deep into enemy territory, and the German pilots climbing to meet them are in for a shock. At this altitude, thin and freezing, propeller-driven engines are supposed to be gasping, their power bleeding away with every 1,000 feet of climb. That is the rule the Luftwaffe has learned to trust. But the aircraft dropping out of the sun towards them today has not read that rule. It is broad in the fuselage, almost bloated, built around a single engine so large that ground crews joke it could power a lorry fleet. And at 27,000 feet, that engine is producing very nearly the same power it would at sea level. This is the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and the reason it can fight where other single-engine fighters cannot is buried deep in its belly, hidden from view, connected to the engine by nearly 6 meters of ducting that snakes the entire length of the fuselage. It is not glamorous. It does not look like innovation. It looks, if anything, like a plumbing problem that got out of hand. But that plumbing problem is precisely why German pilots begin reporting something disturbing in their debriefs during the winter of 1943 and into 1944. American fighters that should be struggling at altitude are instead diving on them with terrifying energy, absorbing punishing fire, and simply refusing to fall from the sky. The engine at the heart of this aircraft is the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial arranged in 2 rows, each cylinder roughly the size of a large biscuit tin, the whole assembly weighing close to a ton before a single drop of fuel is added. On its own, this is simply a very powerful engine. What makes it dangerous is what has been bolted onto it. A turbosupercharger, a device that uses the engine's own exhaust gases, ordinarily wasted as heat and noise, to spin a turbine at speeds exceeding 21,000 revolutions per minute. That turbine drives a compressor, and the compressor forces dense, sea-level pressure air back into the engine even when the aircraft is flying so high that an unmodified engine would be starving for oxygen. The result is an aircraft that does not fade as it climbs. It stays dangerous. And by the middle of the war, in the skies over Germany, that single fact is beginning to matter enormously. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to go back to the problem the Americans faced in 1943, a problem that had nothing to do with courage or tactics, and everything to do with physics. By early 1943, the United States Army Air Forces had a bomber force capable, on paper, of reaching deep into occupied Europe. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator flew their missions at altitudes between 20,000 and 30,000 feet, high enough to be difficult targets for flak batteries, and, in theory, high enough to complicate interception. What the planners had not solved was how to protect those bombers once they flew beyond the range of escorting fighters, which in practice meant almost the entire mission beyond the coast of France or the Low Countries. The early fighters available to American commanders were simply not built for this kind of work. The P-40 Warhawk, serviceable at low altitude, lost effectiveness rapidly above 15,000 feet as its engine's single-stage supercharger ran out of capacity to compress thinning air. The early P-39 era Cobra was worse, so poor at altitude that the Soviets, who used it extensively on the low-level Eastern Front, considered it perfectly adequate for their needs, while American commanders in Europe regarded it as close to useless above 12,000 feet. Neither aircraft carried the fuel to escort bombers deep into Germany, even if their engines had allowed it. The cost of this gap was measured in bombers and in men. Unescorted raids into Germany during the second half of 1943 suffered losses that could not be sustained indefinitely. The raids on the ball-bearing works at Schweinfurt in August and October of that year became notorious for exactly this reason. Bomber crews flying without fighter cover deep into German airspace, facing Luftwaffe interceptors free to attack in relative safety once the escorts turned back at the frontier. The October raid alone cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers, roughly 600 men, in a single afternoon. What was needed, then, was not simply a fast fighter or a heavily armed one. It was an aircraft that could climb to 25,000 or 30,000 feet, fight effectively once it got there, and still have enough engine power left to outdive and outturn whatever the Luftwaffe sent up to meet it. This was an unusually demanding combination. Altitude performance in a piston engine depended almost entirely on how much air could be forced into the cylinders as the atmosphere thinned, and by 1943 the standard method, a mechanically driven supercharger geared directly off the crankshaft, was reaching the limits of what it could deliver without robbing the engine of the very power it was meant to preserve. Every additional stage of mechanical supercharging cost horsepower to drive it. Engineers needed a way to boost the engine's high-altitude performance that did not eat into the power the engine actually produced. On paper, the exhaust-driven turbosupercharger solved exactly that problem. In practice, nobody had successfully built one small enough, light enough, and durable enough to fit inside a single-engine fighter and survive sustained combat. That was the challenge sitting on Alexander Kartvelny's drawing board at Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York, in the months before America entered the war. Kartvelny was a Georgian-born engineer who had trained in Paris and worked for aircraft manufacturers, including Blériot, before emigrating to the United States. By 1940, as chief engineer at Republic Aviation, he had already tried and failed to interest the Army in a lightweight interceptor built around the Allison V-1710 inline engine. The Army rejected it as underpowered and, crucially, as incapable of the high-altitude performance it wanted for bomber escort duty. So Kartvelny did something unusual for an aircraft designer. Rather than sketch an airframe and then search for an engine to fit it, he began with the power plant and let the aircraft grow around it. The engine he chose was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, then one of the most powerful aircraft engines in production anywhere in the world, capable of over 2,000 horsepower in its wartime variants. Pratt & Whitney had begun developing the R2800 in 1936 at its plant in East Hartford, Connecticut, and by the time production ramped up for wartime demand, the engine was being built not only there, but at a vast new Chrysler-operated plant in Chicago and elsewhere, eventually totaling more than 125,000 units across its production life, one of the largest engine production runs of the entire war. Paired with it, Kartvelny specified a General Electric turbosupercharger of a type already proven, though only in far larger aircraft such as heavy bombers, where there was ample room for the ducting and machinery it required. That space problem was the entire design challenge. A turbosupercharger cannot simply be strapped to the front of an engine. It requires exhaust gas to be piped to it, cooled compressed air to be piped away from it after passing through an intercooler, and a mechanism to regulate how much exhaust reaches the turbine in the first place, controlled by a wastegate that vents excess gas rather than letting the turbine spin dangerously fast. Kartvelny's solution was to place the entire turbosupercharger assembly in the rear fuselage, behind the cockpit, near the tail, and run exhaust ducting from the engine all the way back to it, roughly 6 meters of piping snaking beneath the pilot's seat, with a second set of ducts carrying compressed air back forward to the engine's carburetor. Imagine, for scale, running the exhaust pipe of a family car from the bonnet to the boot and back again, twice over, and building an entire section of the vehicle structure around housing it safely. That, in essence, is what Republic's engineers had to do, and it explains why the P-47 grew into the largest, heaviest single-engine fighter of the war, tipping the scales at over 17,000 pounds fully loaded, with a fuselage broad enough that pilots converting from the slender Spitfire or the nimble P-40 often wondered, on first sight, how the thing was meant to fly at all. The payoff for all that bulk and complexity was straightforward and dramatic. Where a conventionally supercharged fighter engine lost power steadily as altitude increased, the turbosupercharged R2800 could maintain something close to its full rated output up to roughly 25,000 to 30,000 feet, the turbine spinning faster as the exhaust gases driving it increased in volume to compensate for the thinning air outside. Above that altitude, the Thunderbolt could still climb and fight where rival aircraft were laboring, giving it a genuine service ceiling above 40,000 feet in later variants. The armor plate behind the pilot, the 8 wing-mounted .50 caliber machine guns, the enormous fuel capacity, all of these mattered, but none of them would have counted for much without an engine that kept working at the altitudes where the war over Germany was actually being fought. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs you nothing but a tap. The Luftwaffe never fielded a true equivalent. German fighter design instead relied on multi-stage mechanical superchargers, sometimes assisted by nitrous oxide or methanol water injection systems, such as MW50, to squeeze extra performance from engines like the Daimler-Benz DB605 fitted to the Messerschmitt Bf109. These solutions worked well at moderate altitudes, but they lacked the turbosupercharger's particular advantage. Because a turbine is driven by exhaust that would otherwise be wasted, it does not draw power directly from the crankshaft the way a mechanically geared supercharger does. German engineers experimented with exhaust turbines during the war, but the technology never reached frontline single-engine fighters in the way it did in the Thunderbolt, partly due to the alloys required to survive turbine temperatures approaching 700 degrees Celsius being in desperately short supply as the war ground on and Allied bombing disrupted German industry. Among the Allies, the closest comparison is the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, which also used turbosuperchargers, one per engine, mounted in the twin booms rather than crammed into a single fuselage. The Lightning's twin-engine layout gave it different strengths and different vulnerabilities, but it confirms that American engineers had, by the middle of the war, made turbo-supercharging work in a way no other air force had matched its scale. The North American P-51 Mustang, meanwhile, achieved excellent high-altitude performance through an entirely different route, adopting the license-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine with its two-stage mechanical supercharger, a solution that was lighter and simpler than the Thunderbolt's arrangement, but arguably never matched the turbo-supercharged R2800 for sheer power retention at extreme altitude. It says something about the scale of the achievement that the definitive American long-range escort fighter used two entirely different technical solutions to the same problem, and both worked. Assessing the P-47's actual impact requires some honesty about what can and cannot be documented. Loss rates and mission summaries from the 8th and 9th Air Forces make clear that Thunderbolt groups became a serious presence over occupied Europe from mid-1943 onward, and pilot accounts consistently describe German fighters attempting to escape by diving, a tactic that had worked against earlier Allied fighters but proved far less reliable against an aircraft that could dive faster than almost anything else in the sky and, thanks to that same engine and its supercharging, recover and continue fighting at altitudes where a diving escape should have offered safety. Precise figures on how many German aircraft were specifically deterred, rather than shot down, are effectively unrecoverable. That kind of psychological effect does not show up cleanly in combat records. What we do have is a documented shift in loss rates for American bombers once fighter escort. First the P-47, and then increasingly the longer-ranged P-51, became available for the whole distance of missions into Germany, and a substantial body of Luftwaffe pilot testimony describing growing anxiety about American fighters that no longer weakened as the fight climbed higher. The R-2800's legacy extended well past 1945. The same engine and refinements of the turbo-supercharging principle it demonstrated went on to power post-war airliners, including the Douglas DC-6, and the broader lesson that exhaust-driven turbines could be made reliable enough for routine operational use rather than experimental use, fed directly into the turbojet and turboprop engineering that displaced piston aircraft entirely within a decade of the war's end. Surviving P-47s can be seen today at museums including the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, and the Imperial War Museum in Duxford, and a small number remain airworthy, still flown at air shows, their turbo-superchargers still spinning up with a distinctive rising whine that pilots of the period compared to a kettle building towards the boil. Return, for a moment, to that morning over Berlin in March 1944. What the German pilots climbing to intercept the bombers could not have seen, was the machinery hidden inside the fuselage of the aircraft diving towards them. 18 cylinders, a turbine spinning faster than 20,000 times a minute, 6 meters of ducting doing the quiet, unglamorous work of keeping an engine breathing at an altitude where breathing should not have been possible. There was no single dramatic breakthrough here, no secret weapon unveiled in a flash of publicity. There was a design problem that seemed, on the face of it, almost impossible to solve within the space available in a single-engine fighter, and there was an engineer who solved it not by making the aircraft cleverer, but by making it larger, heavier, and more complicated than anyone thought sensible, and then building an airframe patient enough to carry that complexity into combat. The Thunderbolt was never elegant. It was never the fastest fighter of the war, nor the lightest, nor the aircraft pilots described with affection at first sight. What it was, consistently, mission after mission, was an aircraft that kept working at the one altitude that mattered most, and that every other single-engine fighter in the world, on either side, struggled to master. That was the whole of the achievement, and it was enough. An engine too large for sensible design, ducting too long for easy engineering, a turbine too demanding for anyone else to perfect its scale, and out of all of it, a fighter that simply refused to weaken when the air ran thin. The Germans learned to fear it for exactly that reason. It did not fly like a nightmare. It flew like a machine that had never been told it was supposed to. That is right. You can also clone custom reference voices in real time.